What word in the Hebrew Bible can be a preposition and also mean a god? What airlines have to do with Genesis 1? And is the geography of the Middle East reflected in the story of creating the seas? We'll find out about that and more in this episode. Hi and welcome. In this channel, we are reading the Tanakh or the Old Testament in Hebrew. No previous knowledge of the language is required. We are starting the third day of the creation, which is kind of exciting. And because we are advancing in our knowledge of Hebrew, slowly but surely, this episode covers 2 verses of Genesis 1. The first is number 9. Most translations are more or less the same, but none was precise enough, in my view, to be able to take over from the King James Version. As you'll see in a little while, some features of the Hebrew are difficult to translate by design, and we will, of course, dive deeper into that later. Here is the verse. It reads as follows: Vayomer Elohim yikavu hamayim mitachat hashamayim el makom echad vetera'eh hayabasha vayehi chen. You might have noticed that the highlights for the English words were jumping all around, more so than in previous verses. As always, we will now go over each of the Hebrew words and see what we can gain that is not available to us when reading the English translations. The first 2 words are Vayomer Elohim, a unit which we have already discussed in verse 3 and verse 6. These words mean literally, and said God. Following them is the verb of the main sentence, i.e. the quote of what God ordered, and it is yikavu. The common translation is be gathered or be gathered together. Unlike the 2 prior instances of commands uttered by God, where the word used in both was yehi or let there be in English, this time we have a different verb, and a special one too. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, yikavu and its related words are strongly linked to bodies of water, large or small. Again, this is a nuance that can be appreciated only when reading the Hebrew, because there is no equivalent word in English. We will elaborate some more on that in our discussion about verse 10 later in this video. One thing I would like to point out here has to do with yikavu as a verb. It is conjugated to be in the future. You might recall my explanation on the letter yod in the video about verse 5. Essentially, when that letter comes at the beginning of verbs and it's not part of the root, this serves as an indication that we are dealing with the future tense, which is also the case with yikavu. And as being in the future, yikavu is actually a description provided by God of what he envisioned to happen next. That is, the water moving to one place. Technically speaking, God did not give an order to the water, but instead described the reality that would follow. Put differently, God did not seem to talk directly to the water. Interestingly, there is a conjugation in Hebrew for the imperative of yikavu, i.e. a command that God might have uttered to the water. This conjugation even appears on the website of the Hebrew Language Academy. The thing is that this command is not very useful for us humans, as it all but involves ordering water to collect or gather, which is something that only God can do. But still, despite being available to him, God decided in our verse not to use the imperative, basically making this conjugation unused for all eternity, or until God decides to tell water to collect once again. I have to qualify this, however, because as we've already discussed, God chose to use the future throughout the creation, with a notable exception. Using the future for commands is quite common in Hebrew, including today, as noted in a previous video. Another thing to note is that yikavu is the first verb in the Bible that is conjugated to be in the plural. As explained in the video about verse 5, the main indication that a verb is conjugated that way is this letter vav appearing at the end. Yikavu is plural since water in Hebrew is always in the plural. Also note that the word let, that appears in virtually all English translations, does not exist in the Hebrew. Lastly, since in English water is mostly collected, for example in reservoirs, and yikavu is a word that is so linked to water, the literal translation of it should probably be will be collected, and the same applies to the final translation. And speaking of water, the next word in the verse is hamayim. This is the 8th time we come across this word for water in this chapter. The word coming after is also one that we've covered in verse 7, mitachat. It is translated as under or below. Looking at this word more closely, note that the first letter is mem, which is the equivalent to m, both in terms of spot in the alphabet and sound. This first letter is actually a highly common prefix, mostly denoting from. So the literal translation of mitachat is from under. Also note that it's possible to drop this prefix like in Genesis 18:4, when Abraham was hospitable to the 3 visitors coming to his tent. Those 2 forms are used in the Bible and in the standard language today, but be careful, the word without the mem is also the A word in modern Hebrew. The next word is the 3rd in a row we might recognize already, and it's hashamayim, which most English versions translate as the heavens. But as said in the video about verse 1, it might be better represented by the sky. The main word is shamayim, and it is preceded by the prefix hey, denoting the in English. Zooming out for a moment, if you've watched my previous video, the last few words together might look familiar to you. There is indeed a very similar unit in verse 7, this one, but with 2 differences. One is the use of shamayim instead of rakia, or firmament. As to the second difference, can you tell which word appeared in the last verse and does not in our present one? Well, it's the word asher, meaning which or that. To appreciate how this might impact comprehension, I'll need to talk just a little bit about grammar. I promise to make it quick. Instead of I liked the book that you recommended me, we can say I liked the book you recommended me without that. In Genesis 1:9, the same mechanism seems to be at play. However, it might be slightly more complicated. Do you remember that mitachat literally means from under, without which or that the text can be read collected from under the sky? There are indeed a few places where mitachat actually means that, i.e. taking something that was under another thing and moving it away from where it used to be. Like Exodus 18:10, the people of Israel were figuratively under the hand of Egypt, and God allegorically took them away from underneath that hand. So due to the absence of asher, or that which, in Genesis 1:9, it is theoretically possible to read the sentence in Hebrew as if the water was under the sky and then taken away to gather somewhere else. For example, the water might have been hanging just under the sky or the firmament and taken from there to be collected in one place, or that the water filled the entire, most, or some of the space under the firmament and was then gathered. To try and decide this issue, there are 7 other places where the unit mitachat hashamayim appears, and all of them indeed mean from under, like in 2 Kings 14:27. But note that all of those 7 verses talk about the annihilation of nations and them being or not being wiped off from under the heavens. Those are obviously nations existing on land, not up in the sky. Here in Genesis 1:9, at least the way I look at it, the verse is most probably referring to the primeval sea that was technically under the sky or heavens in a broad, generalized way, lying low on the surface. Therefore, I translate mitachat as just under. The literal translation of this verse so far can be, "And said God, will be collected the water under the sky." This leads us to the 7th word of the verse, which is a new one for us, el. El is a preposition meaning to. We've seen the related prefixes le and la, which also denote to or to the. In the Bible and the modern language, those two options, el as a separate word and le as a prefix, are interchangeable. However, these days, the use of el somewhat fell out of favor, and we Israelis tend to use the prefix lamed more often. For example, the natural way for us to say, I'm going or traveling to Tel Aviv, is Ani nosea leTel Aviv. The word el is currently mostly used in its conjugated form. Yes, we in Hebrew conjugate prepositions so that they contain the pronoun. For example, bo elai, come to me. This is el, and the letter yod at the end is part of the conjugation to represent me. However, going back to the Bible, if we look more closely in Genesis 1, there might be further difference between the two formats of this same preposition. Note that so far the prefix lamed appeared in verse 5, where God called to the light day, verse 6, in which the Arkia separated between water to water, in verse 7, where it's talking about water above to or under to the Arkia, and finally verse 8 involving giving a name to the Arkia. So the prefix with the letter lamed thus far is mostly used as a grammatical utility linking between parts of speech. It continues along these lines also in the rest of the chapter, as well as in the following one. Note that el appears in the chapter only once, here in verse 9, and this is the sole place where something is described to move from one place to the other. So here, this is a to relating to actual motion. I have to stress that this is not a hard and fast rule, frankly, like many grammatical aspects in the Hebrew Bible. Just one of hundreds of examples to the contrary is 1 Samuel 10:26, where King Saul is obviously moving from one place to another, and the prefix lamed is used. In fact, this so-called rule is no longer being followed as early as the 3rd chapter of Genesis, yet I felt obligated to share this with you, be it significant or not so much. More interestingly, in my view, there are 2 other words in the Bible with the same spelling as el, without the nikud or the diacritical signs indicating the sounds of syllables. Those 3 words look exactly the same. The first of the other words is al, which means don't. For example, Genesis 22:12, where the angel stops Abraham as he was about to kill his son Isaac. There are 2 al here. By the way, can you recognize another word? Well, it's el, meaning to, like in Genesis 1:9, our present verse. The other word with the same spelling as el even sounds the same, but means a god. Just as an initial proof that I'm not kidding you, the 2 letters also appear in Elohim, which is in the plural, while El is in the singular. One example of many where the Hebrew God is referred to as El is Psalms 151, with the word Arkia popping up again. You might be interested to know that the biblical city of Bethel, or Beit El in Hebrew, actually has El, i.e. God, within its name, to mean house or home of God. We can find El in the name Israel or Yisrael, which actually means fight with God, following the nightly struggle of Jacob with a divine person. There are many other biblical names with El in them. The two L's even appear one after the other in Isaiah 45:20. So this is pronounced together El, or to a God. I think this similarity between El and El is a complete coincidence. Since we don't have vowels in Hebrew as separate letters like in European languages, we sometimes get those apparent anomalies. And one last thing about El. You can now read the Hebrew name of the Israeli national airline, El Al, which is not a sponsor or anything. Looking closer at this retro logo, because it's clearer than the current one, El is the word we have been talking about over the last few minutes. And Al is a word we saw in verse 2, meaning on, and in verse 7, meaning above. So the name of the company is literally translated as to above. El Al is an idiomatic phrase in Hebrew meaning up to the sky above, or something akin to that. And it even appears in Hosea 11:7. By the way, another veteran local airline is Arkia, which is also not a sponsor. And this name can be translated as I will soar to the skies. Note the word Rakia in the name of the company. Most English versions indeed choose to translate El as to. The King James Version and a handful of others use unto, which I believe is too high register. Since El is just a simple preposition, the use of into by other versions appears incorrect. The next word is makom. The meaning is simply a place. This word is highly frequent in both the Bible and current Hebrew. Like with place in English, it most often refers to a specific physical location, usually smaller or limited in size. This is exactly the meaning in most of the nearly 400 times where makom appears in the scripture. For example, Genesis 35:15. Again, it's Bethel or Beit El, this time in the context of being a place. Makom also means room, as in available space. For example, when trying to step into an already packed elevator, the people inside might say, En makom, there's no room left. The use of makom with this meaning appears a couple of times in the Bible. Interestingly, makom here in Genesis 1:9 is used in a different way than anywhere else in the Tanakh or the Old Testament, as far as I could find. We don't deal here with a limited sized location, but rather with the vast expanses of the sea. The use of makom here in this verse seems out of place, no pun intended. The next word is echad. We've already come across this one, again, no pun intended. Do you remember where? Well, it was in Genesis 1:5. So, taking the three last words, it's to one place. The literal translation of the verse so far, in my view, is, and said God, will be collected the water under the sky to one place. Until now, we saw that God ordered that the water would be collected in a specific area, instead of covering the whole world. Now we get to the effect or reason of that. The word that follows is vetera'eh, and dropping the ve or end, this is overwhelmingly translated into English as let appear. This might be a correct translation, but not necessarily. Let me explain. Note that the verb tera'eh without the prefix ve has the very same root as yar in verse 4. In this particular case, only 2 of the 3 letters of the root in the words are showing, so you'll have to take my word for it this time. In Genesis 1:4, God saw the light to be good. There, the verb was in the future, shall see, with a converter to the past. In our present verse, based on the conjugation, it's the same root and the same concept, only in the passive voice. So tera'eh means will be seen, by others that is. Yet the same verb can indeed logically also mean appear, for which there is no special word in the Hebrew Bible. Both be seen and appear have to do with vision and can somewhat overlap, and both are covered throughout the Bible by tera'eh and its related words. However, in an attempt to get to the best translation into English and capture the Hebrew text optimally, there are 2 things we should consider. The first one is that appear suggests that dry land or ground might present itself, i.e. the verb is in the active. Do you see what I mean? May I remind you that tera'eh is in the passive. In that respect, be seen seems like a better choice because it agrees with the voice of the Hebrew word. Okay, so let's assume that the dry land or ground will be seen, but by whom? This leads us to the second thing to consider. Well, God might be doing the seeing because he was the only one around at that time, but it can also mean that dry land would be seen by anyone from that moment on. Tera'eh is in the future, and the vav here is not a converter based on the nikud and context. And thus, in the Hebrew original, the land was exposed at that moment and remained visible ever since, with a short interval during the Great Flood. Hence, dry land has been seen from that moment on, and not just by God, but by everyone. This is not necessarily conveyed by appear, which is more momentary in nature. Given all that, I believe that be seen is the better option for the translation. It's a close call and a subtlety for sure, but still. I would like to point out that the only 2 translations that use be seen are the New Life Version and Young's literal translation. Moving on to the thing that will be seen, it is hayabasha. Without the prefix hey or the in English, the word is yabasha. English versions almost unanimously opt for dry land as the translation, and a few use dry ground, and both are reasonably good translations. However, all of them inherently cannot convey a certain nuance. Reading the Bible in Hebrew, yabasha can refer to a permanently dry land, such as a continent or an island, like for example in the book of Jonah, or a temporary one, like the people of Israel crossing in the middle of the Red Sea on dry land or ground. But more importantly, note that the word yabasha does not talk specifically about land. To understand this, let's look at the root of the word, yod, bet, shin, which is also used in many other situations that have nothing to do with ground or land, but instead describe anything that can dry. So no mention of land, but this can be clearly understood through context, with the water moving, exposing something dry, which is the land. Last point about yabasha, The modern term for a continent is Yabeshet, coming from the same root and following the same logic as in the verse, and also originally appearing in the Bible as dry ground in two instances, like in Psalms 95:5. As to the literal translation of Yabasha, it probably should, after all, be dry land or dry ground, but with an asterisk, based on what we've just said about the land or ground not specifically mentioned. I would pick dry ground as my translation, and you might be able to realize why when we get to verse 10. The last two words of the verse are Yehi Chen, which we have already encountered in verse 7, literally translated as "and was so," or in a more English-friendly way, "and it was so." Great, we have just completed reading another verse. Its literal translation appears to be, "And said God, will be collected the water under the sky to one place, and be seen the dry ground, and was so." And let's read the verse one more time in Hebrew with my suggested translation. Vayomer Elohim, yikavu hamayim mitachat hashamayim el makom echad, vetera'eh hayabasha, vayehi chen. I have an announcement to make. Around 8 months in, this project is extremely important to me. I did some stock taking though, and my conclusion was that in order for this channel to remain viable over the medium and even the long term, ad revenue is probably not going to make it happen. The time spent on each episode to optimize the content for you as much as possible is truly way upward of any estimation I had before getting into this, and I knew from the get-go it would be a lot of hard work. Accordingly, my decision is to move to a more member and Patreon-based channel. Therefore, the video after the next one, that is the episode covering the 4th day of the creation, will be a member and Patreon-only episode. After that, every few episodes will also be member or Patreon only. So I hope you understand and don't look at this in a negative way. It's really as little as about $5 per month. And let's take this opportunity to thank a viewer going by the name Grace, who is my most generous Patreon to date, and to thank all my other Patreons and members. Your support and the fact that you took the time and made that decision to trust me means a lot to me, and it is very appreciated. We now move to verse 10. If you've been with me that far into the series, you probably can identify most of the words here. At the very least, they may look somewhat recognizable. You can pause the video and try to see how many you can spot, or better, know the meaning of. There is only one word that is totally new, and 2 half-new words, and you'll see shortly what it's all about. For this verse, I did find 2 English translations that seem to me as more accurate than others. Those are the Tree of Life version and the Lexham English Bible. I eventually picked the former, but added the word "and" at the beginning. That's the only modification I made. And reading the verse in Hebrew, Vaikra Elohim layabasha eretz, ulemikveh hamayim kara yamim, vayar Elohim ki tov. Let's go over this verse and do the familiar words really quickly. For more information about them, it's recommended to watch the respective videos where they first appeared, which I'll mention as we go. The first word of the verse is the verb, vaikra, meaning "and he called" or named. It was discussed in detail in the video about verse 5. Then comes Elohim, God. Next is Layabasha. This is the word for dry ground we've discussed only moments ago in verse 9. Here it is preceded by the prefix la, denoting to the. The next word is Eretz. This is one of the half new words I talked about a minute ago. Without the nikud, it is the same as the word Aretz from verse 1. The two are pronounced only marginally differently, Eretz versus Aretz, and they are actually two forms of the same word. Aretz is used together with the Hebrew prefix for the definitive article, which is the letter Hey, and then we get Haaretz, or the land, just like in verse 1. On the other hand, Eretz, like in verse 10, is used whenever it appears as a standalone word without the prefix Hey. This should be clearer after looking at some examples. In Exodus 3:17, God promised a land flowing milk and honey. Note that the prefix Hey does not appear here. Conversely, the same land is referred to as Haaretz Hatova, or the good land, like in Deuteronomy 6:18. Here we have two prefixes for the before the noun and before the adjective, as required by Hebrew grammar. In other words, Eretz effectively changes its pronunciation whenever the Hebrew definitive article is added, turning it into Haaretz. And as discussed in my very first video about Genesis 1:1, Haaretz or Eretz is most probably not earth. This claim will be reinforced even further when we get to verses 24 and 26. My translation to Eretz is therefore land. The literal translation of verse 10 so far can be, and called God to the dry ground, land. The other half new word in the verse is the next one, mikveh. The actual word here is mikveh, and it's preceded by two prefixes glued to it in front, the letter Vav, which means and the letter Lamed, which means to. But based on a Hebrew grammatical construct that I won't get into now, it means here to the. So combined, those prefixes denote and to the. The word mikveh has the same root as yikavu from verse 9, which we've discussed earlier in this video. As noted there, both mikveh and yikavu in the Bible mostly refer to bodies of water. Perhaps the best example is Exodus 7:19, where God tells Moses to turn all water in Egypt into blood. There is a list of several bodies of water, streams, rivers, and pools or lakes, and then appears Ve'al kol mikveh meimehem, which is difficult to translate literally, yet clearly refers to all other bodies of water that were not mentioned specifically in the preceding list, but were used by the Egyptians and would also be affected. See the word mikveh, just like in Genesis 1:10, and it's adjacent to a conjugated form of the word maim, or water, here meaning their water. So literally, the reservoirs or bodies of their water. Another good example is Leviticus 11:36. Here is the word mikveh, and it's again accompanied by maim, or water, which brings us to the verse we're discussing today. And as you can see, it's the same expression, mikveh maim, but with prefixes in both words that turn it into and to the body of the water, or ulemikveh hamayim in Hebrew. However, for a more complete picture, the Hebrew Bible is very flexible, and there are three places where mikveh or related words are not referring to water. So the link to water is not 100%. Nevertheless, as there are several other words in the Bible to describe acts of collecting, gathering or assembling together, and those other words occur much more often and refer to gathering of many more types of things. We native Hebrew speakers use mikveh only when talking about bodies of water. So the literal translation of ulemikveh hamayim is most probably and to the body of the water. As a cultural note, the word mikveh from Genesis 1:10 is the term used to describe a ritual bath in Judaism used for spiritual purification. A mikveh, or mikveh as it is commonly pronounced, is a must-have in any Jewish community, and in terms of importance is probably at par with the synagogue. Ancient mikvaot, the plural of mikveh, are found in archaeological sites all across Israel. A couple living in a Jerusalem neighborhood even discovered a 2 millennia old mikveh right under their living room when some renovation works were done at their home. The next word is kara, which also means he called or named. For more information about kara versus vaikra, please watch my video about verse 5. Finally, we get to the word that is genuinely new. It is yamim. It means seas, like in several oceans. This is reflected in virtually all English translations. By the way, the singular form is yam, which is a word we use in Israel extremely often, especially during the summer. As the country lies on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, it's not rare to hear people say, Bo nelech layam, let's go to the beach. In Israel, we don't go to the beach, but to the sea. On the other hand, the word yamim is very rare in modern Hebrew in connection to the sea. And this is the case in the Bible as well. The plural form yamim, like in our present verse, appears in the Tanakh or Old Testament about 30 times, almost entirely in poetry, like in Psalms, or in the texts of prophets, which always tend to use a sublime kind of Hebrew, just like in a poem. If you wondered, Ezekiel is the Bible's leader with a third of all appearances of yamim, i.e. seas, in the plural. Back to Genesis 1:10, this and verse 22 are among the only non-poetic places where yamim is used, and there are hundreds of times where the singular form yam appears throughout the Bible. I don't know how significant this is, but here you have it. As a side note, yamim is also the word for days, like 360 days in a year. Yamim as seas and yamim as days are pronounced exactly the same and are also basically spelled identically. You can try and look for the minute differences in the Nikud if you like to. We've already covered the word yom, or day, twice in verse 5 and once in verse 8, or 3 times in total. And now you know how to talk about more than one day, yamim, which will come handy in verse 14. To wrap up this discussion about yamim or seas, you might have wondered why the land is referred to in the singular, but the sea is in the plural. Well, I can't give you a definitive answer, yet I have a theory that is based on geography, and I think it would be safe to share, despite the fact that it's not linguistics. But in order not to break the flow, it will be presented at the end of this video. You can stay if you want after reading verse 10 again. Hence, the literal translation of the verse so far is, "And called God to the dry ground land, and to the collection of the water he called seas." The last few words of the verse are a unit repeating itself several more times later in the chapter. Vayar Elohim ki tov. This unit is very similar to one we saw when the light was created in verse 4. As we discussed there, the unit in Genesis 1:4 is non-standard from the point of view of sentence structure. Here in verse 10, the words et haor are not present, which makes the ensuing unit even more non-standard. Basically, in Hebrew, the verse does not say what was good. English versions overwhelmingly choose to translate this as it was good. It is singular. This might be the case if God saw the entire latest creation as being good. However, in the Hebrew original, there is no it, is, to be, or any other verb or pronoun, and therefore the good can refer, say, to the land and the sea, which together are plural. Having said that, since this same unit repeats itself later in more than just this present context, we might conclude that adding the it was might be a fair compromise to get a grammatically correct English sentence. The unit, Vayar Elohim ki tov, is very likely an expression of generalized satisfaction as God observed another new step in the creation. So the literal translation should be, and saw God that good. And I reluctantly translate this as, and God saw that it was good. Before we read the verse once again, and many of you sign off, if you appreciate what you've just watched, please consider liking this video, subscribing, or even better, becoming a member or a Patreon. One of the best ways you can help me grow this channel is by sharing this or any of my other videos among people you know who might be interested but are rarely or never on YouTube, and also share them with your social media circles. This will have orders of magnitude more impact than me sharing this on my accounts. Thank you in advance. Back to the biblical text, to conclude our discussion about verse 10, a literal translation would be, and called God to the dry ground land, and to the collection of the water he called seas, and saw God that good. And reading the verse one more time in Hebrew, Vaikra Elohim layabasha eretz, ulemikveh hamayim kara yamim, Vayar Elohim ki tov. Now to the theory I promised to share. As you might recall, the name of the dry ground, or Yabasha, in verse 10, is for some reason in the singular, i.e. Eretz, while the sea is in the plural, Yamim, or seas. Why is it like that? What is the source of this difference? Before I continue, it's my hope that sharing my view will not stir a lot of controversy. It's not linguistics, to be sure, but the theory is based on simple geography, not religion. As a disclaimer, please be reminded that I'm more of a language guy with some other general knowledge, not a spiritual guide of any sort. With that in mind, an interesting fact is that from the perspective of people in what is today the Middle East, or the ancient Fertile Crescent, which is the region where essentially all stories of the Tanakh, or Old Testament, took place, there were indeed two seas. But before I explain this, let's look first at the Yabasha, or dry ground. Indeed, this region has a single land mass, and people could and did travel from Persia on the east all the way to Egypt on the west, and in the opposite direction. This is very different when looking at the maritime situation. As noted earlier, there were two seas. One of them is the Mediterranean, which is literally called the Large Sea in the Hebrew Bible. Sailing from Jaffa, or Yafo in Hebrew, it was possible to get to many important civilizations, mainly in modern-day Egypt, Turkey, Cyprus, and Greece. The other sea was the Red Sea, from the port city of Eilat, or Eilat in Hebrew, At one tip of that sea, ships went to a country or a place called Ophir, whose location is unknown but was a major source of gold. Potentially, it was possible to reach Arabia, the Horn of Africa, Persia, Mesopotamia, and even India. And now we get to the interesting fact. To get from Jaffa to Eilat, it would be a 170-mile or 280-kilometer trip by land on a straight line and a bit more using ancient roads. However, to set sail between those same two locations in biblical times, because of this very narrow stretch of land connecting Asia and Africa, it would have required a voyage of 15,000 miles or 25,000 kilometers all around the massive African continent, an endeavor that biblical people never accomplished, as far as we know. Today, the Mediterranean and the Red Sea are connected by the Suez Canal, which was opened in the late 19th century. So, from the perspective of people in antiquity, there were indeed two seas, which were physically separated. Yet verse 9 talks about the water being collected in one place, which is interesting. In the upcoming video, we will read verses 11 to 13. I believe there will be some interesting insights there. Thank you for watching and see you next time.